Before I get into this one, I want to be upfront about something. This story involves the deaths of civilians, including people at a spring festival. So this isn't going to be a hype video. It's going to be a sourced, sober breakdown of exactly what's happened to Iran's bridges in this war, what's confirmed, and what the actual human cost has been. If that's not what you came for today, no hard feelings, but I think this one deserves to be told straight. Let's start with the most serious incident first, because I think burying it under a pile of tactical details would be the wrong way to do this. On April 2nd, during Sizda Bedar, an Iranian spring festival where families traditionally spend the day outdoors, the United States struck the B-1 bridge in Karaj, just west of Tehran. According to documented reporting, 2 missiles hit the unfinished bridge, causing it to partially collapse. Alborz province's deputy governor said the strike killed 8 people and injured more than 95. Iranian outlets reported the victims were civilians celebrating the holiday in the area below the bridge. Here's the detail that makes this specific strike so much more serious than a routine infrastructure hit, and I want to be careful and precise about how I describe it. According to Iran's Fars news agency, a second strike hit the same location after first responders had already arrived to help the victims of the first one, a tactic with a specific name in military and legal circles, a double-tap strike. I want to flag clearly that this specific claim that the second strike deliberately targeted rescuers comes from Iranian state media, and I have not seen it independently verified by a neutral third party. But the pattern itself, a first strike followed by a second one once responders arrive, is a recognized and heavily scrutinized tactic under the laws of armed conflict, specifically because it can constitute a war crime when it deliberately targets medical or rescue personnel. I'm not making that determination here. I don't have the standing or the full evidence to make it, but I think you deserve to know the term and the allegation exist from a credible enough source that it's been documented on the historical record of this war. Let's talk about the timing, because it wasn't a coincidence. According to the BBC, this strike came hours after President Trump had already threatened, in a speech that same day, to bring Iran back to what he called the Stone Ages if the war continued. Let's talk about the bridge itself for a moment, because understanding what was actually lost there matters for understanding the scale of this story. The B-1 bridge, known locally as Bilqan, was a cable-stayed structure standing somewhere around 136 to 138 meters tall, part of the northern Karaj freeway project, meant to ease congestion between Tehran, Karaj, and the routes leading north toward the Caspian Sea. Construction had reportedly started back in 2015, and by the time it was struck this year, it hadn't even been formally named yet, still known simply by its project code, B1. Iranian engineers had described it as one of the most technically ambitious infrastructure projects in the country, and it had been widely reported as the tallest bridge in the Middle East. I want to bring you a detail from AFP's own reporting on the ground, because I think it captures the human weight of this story better than any casualty figure alone can. AFP journalists visited the site days after the strike, during a press tour organized by Iranian authorities. An Iranian engineer named Ruzbeh Yazdi stood amid the wreckage and told AFP, quote, "This bridge was like our child," fighting back tears as he spoke. Another engineer at the site, Hamed Zekri, said the U.S. and Israel were, in his words, attacking only the country's and people's infrastructure. According to that same AFP reporting, an official on site said 12 bombs had been dropped in the strikes. The 2 main support pillars were still standing when journalists arrived, with the word Iran still visible in calligraphy across the structure. But the force of the blasts had sliced the bridge in half at its midpoint, leaving twisted steel beams and chunks of concrete hanging over the void below. AFP journalists reported seeing a villa and residential buildings nearby with blown-out windows, but said they saw no military installations at the site themselves. I need to flag something important here about the actual death toll, because the numbers reported have not stayed consistent, and I think you deserve to know that rather than have me quietly pick whichever figure I saw first. Early reporting, including the figure I opened this video with, put the toll at 8 killed and 95 wounded. But according to the Martyrs Foundation of Alborz province, cited by Iran's official IRNA news agency and later reporting, the toll from this same attack was updated to 13 civilians killed with dozens more wounded. I don't have a clean explanation for that discrepancy. It could reflect people who died later from their injuries, a more complete count as recovery efforts continued, or simply different sourcing at different points in the timeline. I'm giving you both numbers rather than picking one, because pretending there's a single settled figure here would be dishonest given what's actually been reported. Here's something else worth knowing, because it shows just how directly this strike connects to the broader infrastructure threats we've discussed elsewhere in this war. President Trump didn't just acknowledge this strike, he publicly celebrated it, posting a video of the explosion on Truth Social with the warning that there was, in his words, much more to follow. He told Iran to make a deal before it's too late, warning there would be nothing left of what still could become a great country. And in that same post, according to Wikipedia's documented timeline of the attack, he explicitly threatened what was coming next, bridges next, then electric power plants, a threat that, as we've covered in earlier breakdowns on this channel, he would go on to follow through on repeatedly over the following months. Let me be honest about the US side of this too, because a fair breakdown includes both perspectives even on something this difficult. The US military's own framing, according to reporting at the time, was that the bridge was struck specifically because it functioned as a planned military supply route capable of moving Iranian missiles and drones. Whether that specific justification changes how you feel about the civilian toll is something I'll leave for you to decide, but it's the stated rationale, and I don't think it's honest to leave it out just because the outcome was so tragic. Let's talk about how Iran's own government responded diplomatically to this specific strike, because it produced one of the sharpest formal condemnations of the entire war up to that point. According to TRT World's reporting, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi directly condemned the strike, and the incident drew broader international attention, specifically because of how starkly it illustrated the gap between the stated military rationale for hitting the bridge and the visible, on-the-ground reality that AFP journalists documented for themselves days later: ordinary homes with blown-out windows, families who had been picnicking in the valley below, and no visible military installations anywhere near the site. Let's talk about the legal dimension of all of this, because it's not just commentators like me raising questions about where the line sits. Serious legal and human rights organizations have been doing exactly that in formal, on-the-record statements. Al Jazeera laid out the actual legal framework clearly. The 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols forbid attacks or reprisals on civilian infrastructure, or what the law calls civilian objects during a conflict. Washington's stated position has been that it's exclusively targeted military sites, including what officials describe as military logistics infrastructure. And analysts have suggested U.S. military lawyers may be clearing some of these targets under a dual-use designation, meaning infrastructure that serves both civilian and military purposes simultaneously. That's a real, recognized legal category, but it's also one that's been contested throughout this entire campaign. Human Rights Watch put it in the starkest possible terms following President Trump's July 23rd statement, the one where he explicitly promised to bomb a bridge or power plant every time Iran fired at a ship in the Strait, including targets inside Tehran itself. HRW stated plainly that both American and Iranian leaders had threatened to attack targets that could be civilian infrastructure, in violation of the laws of war, noting that Iran's own parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, had responded on social media with an equally sweeping threat that if Iran's security wasn't ensured, no infrastructure would be safe. Separately, a legal news outlet called Jurist reported on an interview with former UN Chief Prosecutor David M. Crane, who offered a blunt historical framing for what's happening here. When a state decides it can't win, it begins to punish civilians. Iran's own High Council for Human Rights issued a formal statement specifically citing this exact pattern: strikes on multiple bridges across southern cities, commercial and fishing piers, port facilities and a maritime tower in Chabahar, rail infrastructure in Bandar Abbas, and Iranshahr Airport, arguing that the deliberate or reckless destruction of this kind of infrastructure isn't merely the loss of a few bridges or ports. It's a direct assault on a nation's rights to security, development, healthcare, transportation, and the basic livelihood of millions of ordinary people. The Council argued this violated the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I want to bring in one more piece of independent, non-governmental data here, because I think it moves this conversation beyond dueling government statements into something closer to verifiable fact. According to reporting from MS Now, Independent Conflict Monitor armed conflict location and event data documented at least 21 separate strikes that hit or damaged civilian infrastructure across Iran in July alone, covering bridges, railways, telecommunication sites, and water facilities, including at least one desalination plant supplying drinking water to thousands of people. That same report included a personal account from an Iranian-American named Zahriana Mohammadi Karakashian Jones, whose relatives live in Bandar Abbas, a southern commercial and military hub on the Strait of Hormuz. She said her family could no longer evacuate their neighborhood by road after multiple strikes on nearby roads and bridges, telling the outlet there's essentially no evacuation route any longer, and that it made her, in her words, embarrassed to be an American. That's about as concrete and human as this story gets: an actual family, with an actual name, cut off from the ability to evacuate their own neighborhood because the roads leading out have been destroyed. I think that detail belongs in this video specifically because it moves the conversation past abstract debates over international law and puts a real, documented human consequence on the record. Let's talk about the internal American political friction this policy has also produced, because it wasn't limited to Iranian officials or outside human rights groups. According to Geneva Solutions, some senior U.S. military officials have reportedly been trying to find ways to avoid classifying these strikes against civilian infrastructure as war crimes, even as international humanitarian law leaves what that reporting described as little room for the administration's interpretation. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly publicly criticized this approach, arguing that military personnel have the right to refuse an unlawful order, criticism that reportedly put him in serious tension with the administration. That's a genuinely significant internal fault line, a sitting U.S. senator publicly invoking the legal right of American troops to refuse orders tied to this specific infrastructure campaign. Now, let's fast forward, because Karaj wasn't a one-time event. It was the opening chapter in a much longer campaign against Iran's bridges that's continued for months. On April 7th, just days after Karaj, airstrikes hit 2 more bridges, along with a train station in Iran, according to reporting at the time. That same day, Trump escalated his public threats even further, warning that Iran's power plants and bridges would be destroyed if Tehran didn't meet a deadline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and separately claiming, in his words, the whole civilization will die tonight if traffic through the strait didn't fully resume. Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, responded by saying 14 million people, including himself, had volunteered to fight, and Iranian officials reportedly urged young people to form human chains, specifically to protect power plants from exactly this kind of threatened strike. Let's jump to the most recent, most intense phase of this campaign, because it's still actively unfolding as this gets put together. Starting in mid-July, after Iran targeted a vessel near the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. launched a renewed military campaign that NBC News described as including days of strikes on ports, bridges, airports, and military facilities across Iran's southern provinces. By July 17th, CENTCOM confirmed this had reached a 7th consecutive night of strikes, explicitly stating the operation was designed to continue degrading Iranian military capabilities at the president's direction. Here's what that 7th night actually did, according to multiple independent outlets covering it. Al Jazeera reported the U.S. destroyed a key bridge and a maritime control tower in southern Iran, with authorities saying at least 7 people were killed in that specific round of strikes. Iran International separately reported that GU-S strikes had destroyed bridges, tunnels, and rail links across southern Iran that same night, severing roads to the Strait of Hormuz coast. One image released by Iranian media specifically showed a bridge in the port city of Bandar Abbas reduced to wreckage. NPR reported that Iranian health officials put the broader weekly toll at 38 killed and over 400 wounded, a genuinely staggering number for a single week of this renewed fighting. Let's talk about Bandar Abbas specifically, because Al Jazeera's own reporting singled it out as a particularly significant target, given its role as Iran's main naval hub and largest commercial port. In that city, a railway facility and the Kahurestan Bridge, which links the port on the Strait of Hormuz to other cities, were both hit directly. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi responded to this specific wave of strikes on Iran's civilian infrastructure by saying, according to Al Jazeera, that the attacks demonstrated what he called the criminal intent of the U.S. ruling body to commit heinous crimes, and in a statement published on Telegram, said the attacks constituted a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. Separately, following the Karaj Bridge strike specifically, Al Jazeera reported Iran had accused the U.S. and Israel of what it called moral collapse, a phrase that ran alongside coverage noting the strikes had also damaged a century-old medical research center in the country that had historically worked on diseases like cholera. President Trump, for his part, responded to that specific round of criticism by warning publicly that Washington, in his words, hasn't even started destroying what's left in Iran. Let's talk about what else was hit alongside the bridges that same week, because the campaign wasn't limited to river crossings alone. NPR reported that overnight, U.S. armed strikes also appeared to destroy a maritime control tower in the Iranian port of Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman, another key commercial gateway near the strait. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared a photo of that tower collapsing on social media. Iran had announced it was closing the Strait of Hormuz on July 12th and launched missiles and drones at its Gulf neighbors in retaliation for renewed U.S. strikes. Strikes that followed an earlier attack by Iranian forces on a merchant vessel that was reportedly abandoned in flames by its own crew. That's the immediate chain of escalation that led into this specific bridge-heavy phase of the campaign, one attack on shipping triggering a cascading response that ultimately reached back onto Iran's own road and rail network days later. Let's talk about why bridges specifically became such a central target category in this phase of the war, because I think the strategic logic here is worth understanding on its own terms. CNN's own reporting described a clear pattern. American precision strikes on Iranian bridges, railway junctions, and power lines connecting key coastline cities, appearing to suggest a wider effort by Washington intended to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz away from Iran entirely. Officials cited in that same reporting said destroying targets like these, alongside missile launchers and radar sites, could also be laying the groundwork for larger military operations the administration had reportedly been considering. I want to flag something CNN specifically noted because I think it's an important, uncomfortable piece of context that doesn't get enough attention. The cities currently absorbing this bridge and infrastructure campaign are, according to that reporting, among Iran's poorest and most ethnically diverse, home to large populations of minority communities, distinct from Persian majority centers like Tehran. That's worth sitting with for a second. The human cost of this specific targeting pattern isn't landing evenly across Iranian society. It's concentrated in some of the country's most marginalized regions. Let's talk about how Iran actually responded to this specific bridge campaign, because it wasn't limited to statements. Mohsen Rezai, a senior IRGC official and military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, warned of what he called a full-scale offensive if the U.S. continued its military strikes. But CNN also reported something important about where Iran's actual retaliation has been landing. Tehran has been striking U.S. allies in the region, rather than the American homeland directly, and several Arab nations have fiercely criticized Iran for exactly that pattern, absorbing the cost of a war they're not the primary party to. Now let's talk about a development that connects directly to all of this, and that I think deserves its own moment, because it happened in a country that isn't even a combatant in this war. On July 17th, the United Kingdom formally designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps as a proscribed organization under a new law called the National Security Act 2026, placing it alongside groups like the Islamic Movement, of Companions of the Right, and Russia's GRU Volunteer Corps. Under that law, expressing support for these designated groups, including glorifying or encouraging activity that threatens UK safety, is now a criminal offense, with providing assistance or accepting money from a designated organization also carrying prosecution risk. Anyone convicted could face up to 14 years in prison. That designation took effect after Parliament approved an order submitted by the Home Secretary just days earlier, and it tells you this war's ripple effects have moved well beyond battlefield strikes into formal domestic legal frameworks in third countries entirely. Let's talk about the diplomatic backdrop running underneath all of this, because even amid this level of destruction, the door to talks hadn't fully closed as of the most recent reporting. Iran International described moderate voices inside Iran sharpening their criticism of hardline calls for continued confrontation, arguing that diplomacy had become what they called a patriotic necessity, given the mounting economic and human cost of renewed war. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf reportedly continued defending diplomacy backed by military preparedness, even as the fighting itself showed no sign of actually stopping. Let me lay out clearly what's confirmed versus what remains disputed here, because a story spanning this many separate incidents across multiple months, involving competing casualty figures and competing legal interpretations from both governments, deserves real precision rather than a single tidy summary. Confirmed from multiple independent outlets, including AFP journalists who visited the site directly. The U.S. struck the Karaj B-1 bridge on April 2nd during a civilian festival, with early reporting putting the toll at 8 killed and 95 wounded, later revised by Al-Borz Province's Martyrs Foundation, as cited by IRNA, to 13 killed. Confirmed. The U.S. has conducted a sustained campaign against Iranian bridges, rail links, and coastal infrastructure, specifically through mid to late July, including confirmed strikes destroying bridges in Bandar Kamir and the Kahurestan Bridge near Bandar Abbas. Confirmed. Iranian health officials reported 38 killed and over 400 wounded across a single week of this most recent campaign. Confirmed from independent conflict monitor ACLED, at least 21 separate strikes hit or damaged civilian infrastructure across Iran in July alone. Confirmed. The United Kingdom formally designated the IRGC a proscribed terrorist organization under new legislation in July. What's disputed and unverified? The specific claim that the second Karaj strike deliberately targeted first responders, which comes from Iranian state media and has not been independently confirmed by a neutral outside investigation as of this recording, and the exact final death toll from that same strike, which has been reported as either 8 or 13 depending on the source and the date of reporting. I'd treat the double tap allegation as serious and credible enough to mention, but not yet established as confirmed fact. So here's my actual bottom line on this entire thread of the war. Iran's bridges haven't just been damaged incidentally in this conflict, they've become a deliberate, sustained, months-long target category, tied explicitly by the U.S. to the fight for control of the Strait of Hormuz, and tied explicitly by President Trump's own public statements to pressuring Iran back to the negotiating table. That strategy has produced real, devastating civilian casualties, most starkly at Karaj, alongside genuine military and infrastructure disruption across Iran's southern coast. Whether you view this campaign as a legitimate wartime pressure tactic or as something that's crossed serious moral and legal lines, and I think reasonable people looking at the same facts can land in different places on that question, the confirmed human cost here is real, it's substantial, and it deserves to be reported with the weight it actually carries rather than dressed up as spectacle. I want to be honest about why I opened this video the way I did and why I've kept that same tone throughout. A story that starts with families celebrating a holiday under a bridge and ends with 8 of them dead isn't content. It's a genuine human tragedy sitting inside a much larger war. And I think the only responsible way to cover something like this is with real sourcing, real context on both sides, and enough restraint to let the facts carry the weight instead of a dramatic thumbnail doing that work for me. All right, before wrapping up, just one thing this time, rather than the usual two, because I don't think a story like this needs a hard sales pitch at the end. If breakdowns that treat difficult stories like this one with the seriousness they deserve are why you're here, I genuinely appreciate you sticking around for whatever comes next in this war, because there's clearly more of this story still to be told. If you want to share your own thoughts on where the line sits between legitimate military pressure and something that's gone too far, the comments are open, and I do read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.